Hi. My name's Marissa Ford. I'm 34, recently back in Santa Rosa, California after what you could call a 6-year detour. A long one. Depending on who you ask, I either disappeared into the desert because I couldn't handle life, or I was off chasing some half-baked dream that didn't quite fit with the family's curated image. Funny how no one ever bothered to actually ask me. If this kind of messy family saga is your guilty pleasure, or if you've ever sat alone at a crowded table wondering why you were the only one left out, go ahead and hit subscribe. Leave a comment, too. Misery loves company, right? Or at least solidarity does. Anyway, I pulled into Santa Rosa last week in a sand-colored Jeep Wrangler that still smelled faintly of the New Mexico sun. The tires made this soft crunch on the gravel driveway of my rental. That sound did something weird to my chest, like a tiny vacuum of old memories trying to rush back in. I parked under a jacaranda tree that had dropped these stubborn purple blossoms all over the hood. They stuck there like confetti from a party I hadn't been invited to. Which, come to think of it, pretty much sums up the relationship I have with my family. Santa Rosa hadn't changed much. The same overdone wine bistros with cursive signs, the same bakeries with smug little lemon tarts lined up in glass cases, daring you to spend $14 just to prove you could. The local indie movie theater still had a flickering E on its marquee. It was comforting and depressing all at once. Like time had stood still, or maybe it just didn't bother showing up at all. I rented a tiny adobe-style house on the edge of town, mostly because it was cheap and no one would notice if I screamed into a pillow at 2 in the morning. I'd done that once or twice. The neighbors probably assumed it was coyotes. I know what you might be wondering. What brings someone like me back here, after so long? After all those years of polite silence from the people who share my last name? Was it nostalgia? Some deep yearning to patch things up? No. It was my father's 75th birthday bash. The official line in the family group chat, that I was never added to, by the way, called it a celebration of legacy. Which is a fancy way of saying it was an opportunity to take photos under chandeliers, toast with overpriced Prosecco, and shuffle around business cards under the table. I didn't get an invitation. Not even one of those digital RSVP things that scream elegance by using serif fonts. The first time I heard about it was through Sienna's Instagram stories. My little sister was all dolled up in a metallic slip dress, hair chopped into this sharp platinum bob that made her look like she was perpetually on her way to a shoot for some organic skincare brand. She posted a boomerang with Ethan, my older brother, clinking glasses under a caption that said, "So proud to honor Dad's vision with my favorite people." Favorite people. That one stung a bit. Which is dumb. I know. You'd think after everything, I'd be numb. Turns out numbness is a myth. It's more like a thin scab you keep accidentally knocking off when you least expect it. I showed up anyway. Not out of some desperate need to be noticed, or to reclaim my place at the table. Honestly, I think I wanted to see if being ignored would still hurt. Spoiler, it does. But maybe not for the reasons you think. On the day of the party, I pulled up to Hillcrest Pavilion Club, the local shrine for old money types who thought Napa was too gauche. A valet with a jawline that suggested he'd rather be on reality TV opened my Jeep door with this glazed, almost pained smile. Like he was trying to figure out how to discreetly tell me that my vehicle was ruining the parking aesthetic. I stepped out in a fitted navy dress, simple, clean, something I'd splurged on back in Albuquerque during a moment of weakness and decent lighting. No sparkles. No brand logos. Just a dress. My boots were tactical. Lightweight. The kind that could get you through a long day or a sudden exit. Some people accessorize with diamond chokers. I guess I accessorize with exit strategies. Inside, the lobby smelled like eucalyptus and old carpet. A hostess in a black blazer gave me this tight little smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. When I told her my last name, she actually blinked twice, as if trying to decide whether I was lost or lying. "We've set you up on the patio, Miss Ford," she said, her voice dropping into that apologetic hush people use when telling you your cards declined or your puppy didn't make it. The patio. Like I was a chain smoker who couldn't be trusted near linen. I just nodded. Because what was I going to do? Kick up a scene in a place where scenes get you politely cut off and escorted out. So that's how I ended up outside, alone at a small round table with a view of the golf course. If you ignored the fact that 30 feet away behind a wall of pristine glass, my entire family was laughing under crystal pendant lights, it was actually a pretty spot. The sky was this deep blue watercolor, fading into salmon at the edges. A string quartet was playing something slow and vaguely melancholy that floated out whenever someone opened the sliding doors. I sat there tracing the rim of my water glass, which no one had bothered to fill, and thought about how funny it was that after everything I'd built, after everywhere I'd been, I was still the kid waiting for someone to notice I was missing from the photo. You ever wonder that? Whether deep down, we all just want a chair pulled out for us? A hand on our shoulder, saying, "Hey, you belong here too?" I was still chewing on that bitter little thought when the door slid open again. A burst of laughter spilled out, then cut off as quickly as it had come. And there she was. Sienna. All golden teeth and perfectly curated delight, making a beeline right for me with a champagne flute in one hand and what I could only describe as judgment in the other. And that, my friends, is where things really started to get interesting. So stick around. This story isn't close to over. Leave me a comment if you've ever been stuck on the outside of your own family's celebration. Trust me, I've got more to share than you'll believe. When I tell people I grew up in Santa Rosa, they usually picture rolling vineyards, fancy farm-to-table lunches, and women in straw hats picking sunflowers. That's partly true. But what no one advertises on postcards is how a town like this also trains you from birth to keep up appearances. In the Ford family, that was practically our religion. Our house sat at the end of a winding drive flanked by olive trees so old their trunks looked like they'd survived biblical floods. The lawn was aggressively green, always manicured down to the last blade, because my father, Philip Ford, believed untrimmed edges said something shameful about a man's discipline. He liked order. Liked things to stay where he put them. That extended to people, too. Inside, the place smelled faintly of cedar polish and Eleanor's lavender hand lotion. My mother kept tiny bouquets of hydrangeas tucked into every corner, entry table, powder room, even balanced on top of the piano she hadn't touched since I was a teenager. It made the whole house feel like it was holding its breath. Ready for a magazine shoot that might never come. We had rules. Not written down, but ironclad all the same. Dinner at precisely 7, even if someone was running a fever. Napkins in laps. Water poured before wine. You smiled for photos even if you'd just been scolded in the hallway. If you asked my dad why we did things this way, he'd say something like, "Discipline builds legacy." As if a lack of smile symmetry could bankrupt an entire bloodline. I used to think all families operated like that. Didn't everyone have to rehearse polite laughter before a dinner party? Didn't everyone get coached on how to stand so your posture would make your grandfather look proud in group pictures? It sounds bizarre now. Back then, it was just life. Ethan, my older brother, was born ready for the role. By 15, he was already mimicking Dad's mannerisms, the way he clasped his hands behind his back when surveying the yard, the slight tilt of his chin that signaled mild but permanent disappointment. Ethan didn't just absorb the rules, he polished them. Even his hair, always neatly side-parted, felt like it had signed some non-disclosure agreement not to embarrass him. Sienna, our little sister, was the family sparkle. She had this bright, musical laugh that made people lean in, made them forgive her scatterbrained ways because oh, look how pretty and charming she is. By college, she'd mastered the art of branding herself. The skincare reels, the carefully filtered brunch shots, captions about finding joy in tiny rituals. I sometimes wondered if she truly believed them, or if she just found the world easier to navigate when everyone was distracted by how effortlessly lovely she seemed. Then there was me. Always a beat off. I was the kid who forgot to cross my ankles when sitting, who got grass stains on my sundress during photo day because I tried to climb the old stone wall behind the orchard. The one who preferred lining up toy soldiers in ambush formations over playing Tea Party. Dad didn't know what to do with that. He'd stand there in the doorway of my room, frown at my maps and little strategy notes, then mutter something to Eleanor about redirecting my energy. Mom would just glide in later with a new hair ribbon or a soft cashmere cardigan she hoped I'd wear to feel more polished. She never told me outright to change. That wasn't her style. But her careful silences spoke volumes. I remember once, during a garden party, I must have been 12, she caught me chewing my thumbnail behind a potted ficus while Dad was introducing Ethan to the Regional Business Council. She didn't scold me. Just gently took my hand, lowered it, and whispered, "Don't give them anything to notice." I didn't understand then. Now I realize she was trying to protect me from the tiny cruelties that swarm around a family like ours. But protection by erasure never sits right for long. If you're wondering whether I felt lonely growing up, the answer is not exactly. It's more like I felt constantly observed, weighed, found slightly off standard. Not enough to be disowned. Just enough to be quietly reshaped. It's a weird limbo. Like being part of a brand campaign you never agreed to model for. Looking back, I see all these small moments where maybe I could have bent a little more, squeezed myself into the mold, and things would have been smoother. Dad wouldn't have sighed quite so heavily at my report cards with history A's but math B's. Mom wouldn't have patted my cheek quite so sadly when I chose camo over cardigans. Sienna wouldn't have laughed that little laugh when I showed up to her birthday lunch in jeans because I'd forgotten the dress code was apparently pastel. But then who would I have become? Some paper doll version of myself? Maybe it's selfish, but I'd rather have my rough edges. Even now, as an adult with more money and power than any of them suspect, there's a little part of me that still remembers standing in front of that gilt-framed mirror by our front door, fussing with my hair, hoping I'd finally gotten it right this time. That I'd finally passed the silent inspections. And for the longest time, I truly believed there would be a payoff. That if I stayed within reach, played it mostly safe, smiled when expected, one day Dad would beam with that solid, certain pride. The kind of look he gave Ethan after his first big property deal, or Sienna after her PR award got featured in a glossy spread. I thought maybe he'd look at me that way, too. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes you can do everything right, or at least everything close enough, and still never get the nod. Because your very shape just isn't what they ordered. And that realization stings in a way no scolding ever could. It's funny, I never thought I'd be the type to dwell on childhood ghosts. I always pictured myself too pragmatic for that, too hardened by years in forward operating bases and tech war rooms. But there I was, just days ago, standing on the edge of that perfect Hillcrest lawn with a flute of flat sparkling water, thinking back to 12-year-old me in that itchy sundress, praying I wouldn't slip up and stain the family image. Maybe that's why, when Sienna finally spotted me out there on the patio, balancing her glass like it was part of her bone structure, I felt a ripple of old nerves. Like I might still get scolded for breathing the wrong way. And trust me, what she said next. It didn't disappoint. If anything, it set the stage for a reckoning I hadn't even planned on. The older we got, the clearer the divides became. It's not like anyone sat us down and said, "All right, here's the family script, please highlight your lines." It was quieter than that. More like an unspoken agreement that Ethan would carry the torch, Sienna would sprinkle glitter over the brand, and I was supposed to stay out of the shot unless I learned how to accessorize my stubbornness with a little more charm. Ethan slid into the family business with the kind of ease that always left me marveling. By 23, he was already hosting casual lunches with local council members at that Italian bistro on 4th Street, the one with the hand-painted plates and the bruschetta that was basically just overpriced toast. He talked shop so effortlessly, zoning permits, investor pools, future master plans, as if they were topics as natural as weather. Dad would sit there, napkin folded just so in his lap, eyes glowing like he was watching his legacy bloom in real time. Ethan had a wardrobe full of navy suits with discreet pinstripes. The cuffs were always tailored to show exactly half an inch of his shirt sleeve, something Dad taught him mattered deeply, because apparently trust was built on shirt cuffs and wristwatches. And the watch, good grief, was a solid chunk of steel he'd picked up in London on a so-called networking trip. It was one of those things heavy enough to double as a paperweight, which, incidentally, might have been the most practical thing about Ethan. Sienna was a whole different flavor. She studied strategic communications at UCLA, which is basically just learning how to say obvious things in pretty fonts. I used to tease her about it, back when we still traded text messages about dumb things like bad date stories or which cafe had the best almond croissants. Now she mostly posted motivational reels from yoga studios or did quick GRWM videos where she paired silky pants with strappy tops, narrating breathlessly about how energy is everything. Her voice would drop into this husky whisper whenever she talked about detoxing negativity. She didn't seem to notice she was also the chief carrier of it. Still, people adored her. Waiters remembered her order, strangers complimented her earrings, old family friends clapped their hands in delight whenever she walked into a room. It was like life just bent a little to accommodate her arrival. She had this gift for making everything look effortless, her skin was always glowing, her laugh landed at exactly the right pitch, and she hugged people with both arms, pressing her cheek close like they were lifelong pals even if she'd just met them at the valet stand. Meanwhile, there was me. The one who joined a specialized intelligence logistics unit straight out of college because I liked puzzles more than parties. Who preferred maps and supply chains over luncheons and didn't mind sleeping on a cot under a buzzing ceiling fan in some converted desert hangar. Who thought wearing the same olive drab cargo pants 3 days in a row was normal, and only realized it might not be when Sienna came to visit base once and wrinkled her nose like someone had opened expired yogurt. I remember the way she looked around the operations tent, clutching her tiny purse to her ribs, her shoulders pinched up. When I offered her a metal folding chair, she lowered herself like she was afraid it would snap or stain her. Later she posted a filtered shot of the sunrise over the dunes with a caption about grit and gratitude. I never did figure out who that was for. Dad didn't quite know how to brag about me. He tried once, at a dinner party, telling his old golf buddies how I was overseas, doing something quite top secret. Then he laughed awkwardly, because the truth is, he hated not being able to quantify my value with a neat title or an easy number. Ethan was securing $20 million deals. Sienna was getting her lifestyle segments picked up by regional TV. I was ghostwriting contingency plans that saved convoys from roadside bombs, but good luck fitting that on a cocktail napkin. Sometimes I'd catch Mom watching me across the table, her head tilted slightly, mouth soft. Like she was trying to figure out which part of the script I'd lost. Or maybe she was silently wishing I'd just fake it better, that I'd flash a glossy smile and sip my wine without accidentally steering the conversation toward the failings of NATO supply lines. I did try. God, I tried. But the longer I sat there in those living rooms stuffed with perfumed people and flutes of kava, the more I felt my insides squirm. Like I was impersonating someone who belonged. Isn't it strange how you can adore your family, even admire parts of them, while still feeling like a guest in your own bloodline? I used to wonder if maybe I was the problem, too blunt, too practical, too suspicious of surface-level glitter. Maybe if I'd softened my edges a little sooner, learned the delicate script of small talk, I'd have found a better seat at their table. But then again, what good is earning a place you have to shapeshift for? A seat that comes with a silent clause telling you exactly who not to be? By the time I hit 30, I'd stopped sending postcards home from my assignments. It just didn't seem to matter. No one ever asked about the coordinates or the last village market I haggled in or how the local kids laughed when I tried their spiced tea and nearly choked. When I did come back on leave, Ethan would pat my shoulder with distracted affection and Sienna would squeal about my tough girl boots, not realizing they were worn because desert rock chews up leather like gum. Dad would study me with that evaluative look, tapping his wine glass absently as if searching for the right compliment that wouldn't sound forced. All of it added up to a silent agreement that we were different creatures, existing side by side but breathing slightly incompatible air. And maybe that was okay. Maybe some families don't merge so much as carefully orbit each other, maintaining polite distances. I believed that for a long time. Until that night at Hillcrest, when Sienna walked toward me across the patio, glass of champagne catching the last strands of golden hour, her mouth forming my name like a polite question mark. And in that moment, I realized the distance hadn't protected us from anything. It had only delayed the collision. I was 22 the first time I truly felt the world crack open under my feet. Not in that thrilling, movie trailer way. More like the floor dropped out and left me dangling by my own stubborn grit. When I signed my enlistment papers, it didn't happen at some solemn courthouse or with a brass band in the background. It was a cramped recruitment office squeezed between a vape shop and a tax prep place in Modesto. The linoleum floor was yellowed, and the coffee in the lobby tasted like burnt cardboard. I wore a loose gray hoodie and had my hair up in a careless bun because I hadn't yet realized I was stepping into a chapter that would never entirely close. There was no dramatic goodbye either. Ethan sent me a quick "proud of you, sis" text with a thumbs up emoji that somehow cheapened it more than if he'd said nothing. Sienna posted a filtered photo of us hugging in front of the station, tagging it with "family forever," even though I noticed she cropped out half my torso so her new handbag could be center frame. Mom stood stiff beside me, fixing my collar as if I were heading to a church potluck. Dad didn't come at all. Said he was tied up with a planning committee luncheon that couldn't be missed. I remember nodding like I understood, even though part of me wanted to slam my hand on the table and demand he look at me, really look at me, one last time. Maybe I expected basic training would be the hardest part. I was wrong. That was just sweat and blisters, predictable stuff. What came after, when they shipped me off to a logistics command post in a scorched corner of Jordan, that's when reality stopped being polite. It's strange the little things you remember. The chow hall's endless trays of rubbery scrambled eggs that somehow always smelled faintly of bleach. The sun slamming down on your helmet so hot it seemed to rattle your teeth. The generator hum at night that masked your heartbeat so you had to press 2 fingers to your neck to make sure it was still there. I ended up specializing in supply extraction and convoy route optimization, basically getting the right gear to the right people without them ending up on a list of casualties. I was good at it. Fast, too. My mind liked the puzzle of terrain and threats, how you could slide variables around until fewer people died. Some nights, I would lay on my cot staring at the corrugated metal ceiling, feeling weirdly satisfied that somewhere out there, a small team made it back to base because I rerouted a supply truck through an abandoned olive grove instead of a main road littered with broken promise signs. But war zones have a nasty habit of reminding you they're in charge. One evening we got hit by a sudden rocket burst, nothing sophisticated, just blind hate shot in our general direction. A chunk of shrapnel found me while I was sprinting across the yard, trying to help resecure a loose SATCOM dish. It cut across my wrist, hot and shockingly clean. When I pulled my glove off later and saw the neat pink line already puckering, I felt a bizarre sense of betrayal. Like my own skin had turned on me. They stitched it up in the field tent under buzzing fluorescent lights. The corpseman had bad breath and hands that shook a little, but he was gentle. Gave me a lollipop after, some leftover batch meant for local kids, cherry-flavored and gritty with dust. I remember sitting on a plastic chair outside the tent, sucking on that lollipop, watching the horizon darken into bruised violet. Wondering how I'd tell my mother about it. Or if I even would. Spoiler, I didn't. Not until months later, when I came home on emergency leave for an old family friend's funeral. I was standing in the kitchen at Mom's house, still half in uniform, tracing the thin scar with my thumb. She caught me and frowned like she'd discovered I'd chipped her favorite vase. "What on earth is that from?" she asked, her voice caught somewhere between concern and annoyance. I tried to keep it light. Said something about how it looked worse than it was, just a scratch from some flying metal, no big deal. She didn't touch my hand. Didn't ask if it hurt. Just pulled a bottle of lotion from the counter, passed it over, and told me scars faded better if you moisturized. Then she changed the subject to whether I'd seen the new landscaping around the pool. That's when it hit me. We lived on 2 completely different emotional planets. On hers, danger was a delayed flight, or a gossip column that mentioned the wrong cousin. On mine, it was a dusty backroad where you weren't sure if that pile of rocks ahead was just geology or an IED. You ever have that moment with your parents where you realize they'll never really understand the most critical parts of you? Like there's this heavy vault inside your ribs filled with all the choices that actually shaped you, and they'll never bother to ask for the combination? I stood there by the kitchen island, feeling more orphaned than I ever did overseas. I left 2 days later without much fanfare. Sienna air-kissed me, careful not to smudge her gloss. Ethan promised to keep me in his prayers, which he probably did, at least once before bed, sandwiched between meetings and his morning protein shakes. Dad finally called the next week. Not to ask how I was recovering, or if I was scared of going back. He wanted to know if I needed help quieting the incident in case it threatened any future press. His exact words were, "We can bury that story for you. I've got connections." That was the day I stopped hoping he'd ever see me beyond how I might wrinkle the family brand. The day I quietly decided I didn't want my scars edited out of the record. And that choice, as small and private as it seemed at the time, would come to mean everything. But that's a twist we'll get to in a bit. The convoy incident still lives in my head more vividly than most birthdays. Which probably says something about the human brain and how it decides what deserves permanent storage. It happened outside a speck of a village near the Jordanian border. The kind of place that didn't show up on any map my mother would have bothered to unfold. 3 trucks loaded with med kits, for fluids, and a couple of critical comms devices were supposed to snake up a dusty ravine and link with a team that had been pinned down for almost a day. I'd spent the morning hunching over a screen in our DimOps trailer, tracking little blinking icons while trying to ignore the stale reek of instant coffee and old sweat. Command wanted us to sit tight. They were waiting on overhead cover, maybe a drone pass or a couple gunships to soften possible threats. But the weather was tanking fast. Satellite feed was already looking like a bad watercolor, brown and gray smears bleeding together. And that meant by the time air support sorted itself out, we'd be sending home body bags instead of field reports. It sounds clinical when I replay it now. Back then, it was more of a gut decision. Like every rulebook line blurred until all that remained was a single, bright urgency: move now or clean up later. I tapped into a drone feed I technically wasn't cleared to use, an Israeli model, loaned under half a dozen hush-hush agreements. Spun it over the ridgeline, spotted what looked like hastily covered divots along the convoy's original route. Classic signs of fresh planting. Not vegetables. The other kind. I replotted the course on the fly, pushed them through a dry riverbed I'd scouted 2 days earlier while cataloging alternative supply lines. It wasn't pretty. The trucks took a hell of a beating, axle deep in silt at some points, suspension groaning like it was filing complaints. But we came out the other side with 12 men banged up and bruised, 2 with minor fractures, 0 dead. 12 breathing people. I'd take that math any day. Afterward, I expected maybe a quiet thumbs up from my CO. Or hell, a half-warm cup of coffee delivered to my corner of the ops room. Instead, I got summoned for a formal review. A clipboard-heavy major with a birthmark like a second eyebrow sat across from me and asked if I understood the magnitude of my insubordination. He kept using that word, insubordination, as if the alternative hadn't been the real problem. There was a stack of papers in front of him, edges crisp, official ink stark against recycled beige. I could see a commendation letter peeking out, right on top of a disciplinary form. That was the paradox no one liked to talk about. You could save a dozen people and still be written up for how you did it. Rules were the real oxygen in these places. I signed the reprimand. What else was I gonna do? Argue until someone noticed the irony? The colonel who read my final summary wouldn't even meet my eyes. He just scribbled his signature, slid it across the table, and said, "You're lucky it's only a letter in your file." Maybe. But the truth was, I didn't feel lucky. I felt hollow. Like I'd gambled all my credibility to keep 12 hearts pumping, and the house had charged me double for the privilege. When word trickled back to Santa Rosa, because bad news has a travel agent, and mine always booked first class, the story got chewed up by local gossip into something barely recognizable. At the Hillcrest brunch circuit, it was all, Marissa went rogue in uniform. Almost jeopardized an entire operation. The way they whispered it, you'd think I'd single-handedly sold off national secrets for a couple souvenirs. Sienna texted me a screenshot from a local newspaper that used an embarrassingly outdated headshot of me, one from my basic training graduation when my bun was still regulation tight and my face looked 10 shades too eager. The caption read, "Local daughter's controversial mission raises eyebrows." Sienna added a winky emoji with, "Drama queen, even from across the world." Ethan didn't reach out at all. Then Dad called. I still remember standing in that tiny internet cafe on base, painted an unfortunate shade of mint green, buzzing with flies that liked to land on the screen just as I tried to read my inbox. Dad's voice came through the headset, calm, deliberate. The same tone he used whenever he was disappointed but didn't want to sound messy about it. He didn't ask if I was okay. Didn't mention the guys who got home on account of a rule I broke for them. What he did ask was whether I wanted him to make it go away. He said he could tap a couple connections, help soften the narrative, so it wouldn't follow me back into polite company. I remember staring at a smudge on the computer monitor. Someone before me had pressed an oily thumb there. It looked like a fading comet. I told Dad no, that I'd live with it. He went quiet long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. Then he cleared his throat and simply said, "Suit yourself," before hanging up. A week later, a card arrived from my mother. Not a letter. Not even a voicemail. A thin white card with delicate embossed lilacs on the front. Inside, in her tight, graceful handwriting, she wrote, "Praying for your clarity. Consider your future more carefully next time." No mention of the scar on my wrist that still flared whenever I twisted too quickly. No hint that maybe she understood why I'd chosen to act. Just a hope that I'd be more convenient the next round. You ever wonder how many people are walking around carrying decisions no one else would have made, yet still paying interest on them every single day? Sometimes I catch myself rubbing that old scar, not because it hurts, but because it reminds me of the moment I stopped playing their game. And the irony is, that little rupture in my record, the line item that made me persona non grata at family fundraisers, is exactly what taught me how to gamble smarter later. Which is how we all ended up here, on a patio neither of them planned for, waiting on a storm none of them saw coming. The invitation never came. Not officially, anyway. I found out about Dad's 75th birthday party the way most family exiles do, through somebody else's bright, oblivious social media post. Sienna had uploaded a story the night before, panning across rows of tables dressed up in ivory linens, the edges fluttering under warm patio lamps at Hillcrest Pavilion Club. A pair of servers were fussing with a champagne tower that glittered like it was auditioning for a jewelry ad. She added a caption with 3 sparkles and a heart, something like, "So honored to celebrate Dad's legacy tomorrow with the best people." Best people. I had to laugh. It was so on brand. The morning of the party, I drove over to Hillcrest in my beat-up Jeep. A couple of blossoms from the plumeria tree in my rental's yard had blown in through the cracked window and now sat on my passenger seat, crushed and slightly browning. Somehow that felt appropriate. The club itself was still the same old polished monster it had always been. All grand archways, manicured hedges, and discreetly placed golf carts. Inside, the main lobby hummed with that expensive hush you only get when wealth and old carpet join forces. A crystal chandelier hung over the front desk, casting sharp specks of light on everything below. The air smelled like eucalyptus candles layered over decades of sun lotion. When I gave my name to the hostess, young, trying too hard not to look nervous in her tight black blazer, she paused, tapped her tablet, and then tilted her head in a way that told me everything before she even opened her mouth. "Oh. Miss Ford. Right. We've seated you on the north terrace, if that's all right. Not inside with the family. Not under the chandeliers or near the hand-carved bar where Ethan was probably already working the crowd. The terrace." As if I were carrying something that might drift off me and ruin the table settings. I told her that was fine, because what else could I do? 'Cause a polite scene? I didn't exactly have a history of winning popularity contests in this zip code. The terrace was actually nice if you ignored the reason I was out there. A little stone patio dotted with heavy wrought iron tables, overlooking the ninth hole where a couple of middle-aged men in matching sun hats were gently hacking at the grass. I sat down at a table for two that someone had set with a small vase of yellow freesia. The petals were starting to curl at the edges. A server dropped off a glass of water without so much as a glance, the ice mostly melted. Through the wall of spotless glass that separated me from the main dining room, I could see my family bathed in warm golden light. Sienna was flitting from table to table, her pale pink dress clinging perfectly to her sharp shoulders. Her hair was twisted up in a messy knot that probably cost $300 at one of those downtown salons where the stylists call you babe and the receptionist offers you cucumber water. Ethan stood near the head table, leaning in to share some joke with Dad, who was nodding along with that tight, practiced grin of his. Every so often, Dad would lift a hand slightly, two fingers together, like he was conducting invisible strings. It was the same gesture he'd use at family dinners to quiet the room when he was ready to pronounce something worth etching into stone. Watching them, I felt like I was staring into a diorama of my own history. Everything perfectly arranged. No dust. No stray wires. Certainly no place for me to step inside and rearrange anything without breaking the spell. It's a weird thing, being physically so close to the people who made you, but separated by a pane of glass that somehow feels thicker than concrete. The laughter didn't quite reach me out there. It broke against the window in soft puffs, left behind only the murmur of leaves overhead and the low mechanical whir of a golf cart somewhere behind me. I caught myself tracing the rim of my water glass over and over, a nervous tic I didn't remember picking up. Probably something my body invented to keep from walking through that door and demanding someone, anyone, say they were glad I'd come. But I knew better. I'd learned years ago that you shouldn't audition for parts in productions that never wrote you a role. Still, there was a small mean hope tucked under my ribs. That maybe someone would notice me out there. Maybe Sienna would pause mid-laugh, peer through the window, and shoot me one of her big-hearted smiles. Maybe Ethan would slip outside with a plate of those little crab tartlets they both loved, toss one my way, and say, "Glad you made it, sis." Instead, I watched Sienna pull out her phone and do a quick pan of the room, no doubt filming a sweet snippet for her followers about celebrating Dad's monumental milestone. Ethan was close enough that I could see the way he kept one hand in his pocket, his thumb running over his cufflink like he needed the tactile reminder that he belonged exactly where he stood. I let out a small breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. In that instant, it was like all those years of dusty Christmas cards, missed calls, and quiet, disappointed sighs condensed into a neat little realization. I was there. Present. Breathing the same floral-tinted air. And still entirely peripheral. That would have been enough of a bruise for one afternoon, honestly. But then the sliding glass door cracked open and out stepped Sienna, delicate as always, holding her phone loosely in one hand and a half-drunk glass of Prosecco in the other. Her eyes landed on me, widened with a flicker of something that might have been surprise or mild horror, and then she started toward my table with that smooth, hips-first stride that looked practiced down to the ankles. And right then, as she was closing the gap between us, I felt my pulse do this sharp, traitorous skip. Because I knew from the look on her face that whatever was coming next wasn't going to be the gentle, golden reunion some naive corner of me still pretended to hope for. "I promise, you're going to want to hear exactly what she said." Because that was the moment this whole polite facade started to crack, and trust me, the fracture lines only got deeper from there. Sienna reached my table with that graceful sort of half-pout she liked to wear when she wasn't sure if she needed to look apologetic or effortlessly above it all. Up close, I noticed her lipstick was a shade warmer than her usual nude gloss, something closer to coral, and it made her teeth look very white when she smiled, which she did instantly, as though on muscle memory. "Oh my God, Riss," she cooed, drawing out my nickname like it was part of a melody. "I didn't even realize you were coming. I mean, we thought." She caught herself, probably because the rest of that sentence was going to be something like, "We thought you wouldn't dare show up." Instead, she tucked a piece of hair behind her ear and looked out across the golf course as if the horizon might bail her out. I gave her a small nod. It was the safest currency I had left. Anyway, I would have totally found you a spot inside if I'd known. The patios, it's lovely, but it's also kind of where they usually seat overflow guests. Her eyes darted back to mine, waiting to see if I'd bristle. I didn't. I just kept tracing my water glass. In some ways, the blunt honesty of her slip-up was almost refreshing. At least it was closer to truth than any polite fiction. She leaned her hip against the wrought iron railing, took a slow sip from her flute, then lowered her voice into that conspiratorial hush she often used for gossip or half-serious warnings. I just don't want you to feel weird, okay? Because honestly, it's mostly Dad's work friends tonight. Ethan's over there talking about his new developments like he's curing cancer. Total snooze fest. Her laugh was light, practiced. The kind that said, I'm easy, I'm breezy, don't worry about me, even though her eyes were scanning the doors as if worried someone might catch her fraternizing with the family black sheep. I'm fine, I told her, and for the first time in a while, I actually half meant it. Fine in the sense that I was well beyond expecting anything else. Oh good, she chirped, her shoulders dropping a fraction. Because you know how this family is. Legacy, appearances, all that jazz. It's exhausting. I swear, I'd rather detox for a week in Tulum than hear Dad brag about Ethan's zoning approvals one more time. She was trying. I'll give her that. In her own fluttery, surface-level way, Sienna was trying to show me that she got it. That she was maybe a tiny bit trapped too, under different expectations. I wondered if she ever lay awake at night, thinking about how often she had to perform delight just to stay in the family's good graces. A breeze stirred between us, lifting the edge of the linen napkin in front of me. Sienna gave me one last look, half hopeful, half resigned, then said she should head back in before the speeches. But seriously, come in whenever. It's not like there's a bouncer. She laughed at her own joke, touched my shoulder lightly, the barest skim of fingertips, and then turned, disappearing through the sliding doors. A faint swirl of her perfume, something citrusy and expensive, lingered behind. I exhaled. It felt like releasing a tiny valve inside my ribs. Not 2 minutes later, I heard a familiar voice that made my stomach instinctively tighten. Ethan. He didn't wait for permission. Just strolled right up, hands shoved into his pockets, jacket unbuttoned like he owned not just this party, but probably the continent. Marissa, he drawled, drawing out the syllables the same way he used to when we were kids and he wanted to sound worldly. I'll be honest. Didn't have you on the guest radar. I noticed, I replied, keeping my tone as flat as the table surface between us. He smirked, rocking slightly on his polished loafers. Look, I'm not saying it's awkward, but you did kind of drop in unannounced, no +1, driving that, what is that, an old Jeep? And now you're camped out here like you're casing the place. My eyebrows rose. Should I have brought a date to validate my seat? That earned me a low, fake laugh. The kind that didn't wrinkle his eyes. Touché. But come on, you know how this looks. Dad's 75, he's got business associates flying in, investors sniffing around the new Mariposa complex. And then here's his MIA daughter popping up out of nowhere. I tilted my head, studying his face. It was the same one that used to grin at me across a Monopoly board on summer nights, gloating when he bankrupted me out of Boardwalk. Only now, it had a sharpness that wasn't there before. Or maybe it always was, and I'd just learned to see it. You worried I'll embarrass you? I asked. Ruin the narrative about the perfect Ford heirs? His smile twitched. It's Dad's night. Try not to make it about you. I almost laughed. Almost. Because here was Ethan, standing in front of me with his soft tan suit and a gold watch that probably cost more than my entire last deployment, telling me not to make things about me. When the reality was, none of this had ever been about me. Not once. He gave a little half salute, casual and dismissive. Enjoy the fresh air. Then he turned and walked back toward the clubhouse, probably already composing some clever anecdote for the crowd inside. I sat back in my chair and let my shoulders drop, finally alone again. The overhead heaters clicked on with a soft whoosh, sending a brief wave of warmth across my arms. It was weird, but instead of feeling like I'd been diminished by those encounters, Sienna's airy guilt, Ethan's wary superiority, something inside me had started to sharpen. Like each patronizing smile and gentle brush-off was whittling me down to a point I didn't even know I could still reach. And that, right there on the terrace, is when the first real flicker of what was coming next sparked through me. Because if they thought this was just another evening of polite avoidance, well, they were about to learn how very wrong polite could be. For a long time, I thought I'd managed to box up that chapter of my life so tightly it wouldn't leak into polite moments like this. Turns out memory doesn't give a damn about your carefully curated mental shelves. It seeps in wherever it wants, usually when you're trying hardest to look unbothered. Sitting there on that patio, my hands resting on the cool metal of the chair arms, I found myself absently running my thumb along the faint ridge of the scar on my wrist. It was a tiny thing now, a pale line that could pass for an old burn from the oven if you didn't look too closely. But I knew every millimeter of that mark. Knew how it came with a story no one in that glittering dining hall would ever bother to ask about. Funny how a thin piece of tissue could still feel heavier than any of Dad's monogrammed cufflinks. My mind drifted back, not because I wanted it to, but because sometimes your past drags you like a dog on a leash. I could almost smell the faint chemical tang of disinfectant that hung around our forward operating station. Could hear the steady, almost soothing churn of generators out back. Could see the battered coffee urn that we all swore produced the worst brew in 3 countries but still gathered around anyway, just for the ritual of it. Back then, my days were measured not by dinner reservations or property deals, but by the steady stream of encrypted briefings, by field radios crackling with half-clear instructions, by the adrenaline spike when a convoy ran late. Most nights, I'd fall asleep still in my boots, stretched out on a narrow cot with a lumpy pillow that smelled faintly of sand and someone else's shampoo. And I'd feel oddly at peace. Because in that world, your worth was simpler. You did your job or people didn't come home. There wasn't much room for confusion. I wonder sometimes if that's why I lasted so long in places most people would pay serious money to avoid. Maybe I craved the clarity of it. In Santa Rosa, back at family dinners where Dad would drone on about legacy trusts and Ethan would pivot any topic into a new square footage brag, my head always felt foggy. Like I was supposed to be catching something important floating between words, and failing. Over there, everything was brutally direct. If your gut said move, you moved. If your intel screamed risk, you found a new route. And if you saved 12 soldiers by breaking protocol, no one in the field questioned your ethics. Not until it reached a desk stacked with paperwork and men with reputations to polish. I rubbed the scar again, slower this time, tracing the old path. I could almost feel the first hot sting of that fragment slicing through me. Could hear the medic's voice, Ruiz, a guy from El Paso with a lopsided grin and nervous hands, telling me, "You're lucky, Ford. Another inch, you'd be riding with your other hand for life." I remember laughing because I didn't want him to see how close I was to shaking. You ever have a moment that changes how you carry every single day after? That was mine. Not the pain of it, or even the fact that I almost lost motor function. But because it came on the tail end of a decision I'd made entirely alone, in a dusty tent with sweat sticking my shirt to my spine and every protocol in the book whispering that I was wrong. I could have waited. Could have let the chain of command grind along at its safe, sluggish pace. Could have told myself it wasn't my place to reroute the convoy. But then we'd be tallying up body counts, sending more handwritten letters that started with "The Department of Defense regrets to inform you." So yeah. I broke the rules. I broke them with eyes wide open, fully ready to eat the consequences, because that was the only way to keep 12 men breathing long enough to send them home to people who'd miss them more than any rulebook ever could. And for that, I got a citation tucked behind a formal reprimand. A neat pair of documents that balanced each other out so no one had to be too uncomfortable. I sometimes pictured my file back at headquarters, 2 pages side by side, one praising initiative under duress, the other outlining procedural failings, all wrapped up with a bureaucratic bow. It should have made me angry. Maybe part of me was. But more than anything, it felt clarifying. Like it slapped every last illusion out of me about how honor actually works. It's never clean. Never as photogenic as Dad's birthday parties or Sienna's influencer brunches. It costs something raw and personal, and you pay in slices of your own piece. So there I was, years later, at a country club that smelled like roasted garlic and expensive cologne, lightly sweating under patio lamps, still absently massaging that scar like it was a talisman. Meanwhile, my family was inside clinking glasses, probably oblivious to the fact that the only reason I'd shown up at all was to see how little it might still hurt. And here's the kicker. That old ache, the one that used to keep me up at night wishing Dad would call just to say, "I'm glad you made it back," it didn't sting quite the same anymore. Not because I'd stopped caring. More like I'd finally realized caring was its own private war, one I didn't need to keep fighting for people who wouldn't even show up to the field. As I sat there, soaking in the faint strains of piano drifting out from the dining hall, I felt something click inside me. A small, almost weightless shift. I wasn't that kid anymore, desperate for a seat at their table. I wasn't even the soldier still hoping for absolution. I was simply me. Scar and all. And whether they recognized the cost of that or not, well, that was about to become a whole lot clearer. Because if you think this little patio exile was the end of the story, stick around. You haven't seen how I play my cards yet. It was somewhere between the second wave of polite laughter from inside and a stray napkin skating across the terrace tiles that I finally checked my phone again. I'd been ignoring it all night, partly out of respect for the fragile bubble I'd built around myself, partly out of stubborn pride. Because if there was one thing my family taught me, it was how to pretend you weren't waiting for anyone to reach out. I unlocked the screen, thumb hovering a second longer than necessary. 3 new notifications blinked at me, crisp little digital intrusions on my otherwise old-world setting of lavender planters and muted string quartets. The first was from Harrison, my CFO over at Aegis Axis. Singapore market window closes in 90 minutes. Final docs ready. Just say the word. My pulse picked up, not in panic, more like that smooth rev of an engine right before it hits the open highway. I tapped through to the secure portal, where a neat cascade of approvals glowed in green. Regulatory sign-offs. Board ratifications. Digital signatures from more countries than I cared to count at that moment. It struck me how absurd it all was. I was sitting in a folding metal chair on a patio outside my father's 75th birthday party, wearing a dress that still smelled faintly of hotel laundry detergent, while quietly deciding the fate of an entire real estate empire. Meanwhile, inside, they were probably passing around mini crab cakes and telling stories that made Ethan sound like a one-man economic miracle. Sometimes life doesn't just hand you irony. It gift wraps it in gold foil and ties a bow. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool night air settle into my lungs. This was the thing no one in there knew. While they were toasting Ethan's latest zoning conquest, I was finalizing a deal that made all his proud little ledgers look like lemonade stand math. Because today wasn't just about me lurking on the outskirts of a family photo. It was also the day I quietly acquired controlling interest in Fortson Properties, the same company my father had built from scratch, the same one he was grooming Ethan to inherit like a crown. Not that they'd bothered to learn what I'd been building. I'd let them believe for years that I was tinkering with random freelance contracts, maybe doing small-time logistics work for mid-tier tech firms. I never corrected them. Part of me found it perversely satisfying to watch their eyes glaze over whenever I dropped a hint about my real business. They were so certain nothing substantial could come out of my corner of the world. That I was still off chasing dust storms and questionable field rations. You ever wonder how often we let people box us in because it's easier than fighting for their curiosity? For the longest time, I figured it was better not to disrupt their assumptions. They didn't want the real story, anyway. They wanted a tidy narrative where Marissa was still finding herself in borrowed apartments and used jeeps, popping up once in a while with sunburned cheeks and boring tales about foreign contractors. And fine. Let them have it. It bought me time to build something they couldn't even spell, let alone sabotage. Another ping drew my eyes back to the screen. This time, a direct message from Priya, my operations chief. Transfer mechanism fully triggered. Ownership doc queued for your confirmation. Once executed, you'll be at 82.4% control. Do you want the press on standby or stay dark? I stared at her text for a long moment. The screen light caught the small scar on my wrist again, making it look like a faint silver thread. I wondered, not for the first time, if the girl who'd once jumped at every order, terrified of stepping out of line, would even recognize the woman I'd become. Or if she'd quietly salute and step aside. Because here's what no one inside that party understood. The same instincts that once rerouted convoys under fire were the ones that helped me map the soft underbelly of Fordson's messy acquisitions. The same appetite for quiet risk, for making decisive moves while everyone else hesitated. It was exactly why I was in a position to buy the ground out from under my own family's feet. It wasn't revenge. At least not purely. It was more like a course correction. For years, I'd watched them expand beyond their depth, pile on debt with the assumption it would all smooth out in the next cycle. They built shiny towers with fragile math. And the more they bragged about how the Fords always find a way, the more I realized someone eventually had to step in and make sure there was actually a way. So maybe I was the black sheep after all. But I'd become the one quietly paying the herd's overdue grazing bill. My phone buzzed again, insistent now, as if to say, time's up. I opened the secure app, thumb hovering over the biometric pad. For a second, I just listened, really listened, to the sounds around me. Soft clinks of glasses inside, the distant muted applause, a snatch of piano drifting through a cracked door. It all felt strangely small compared to what waited in my inbox. Then I pressed my thumb down. The screen blinked once. Then the text scrolled across. Transfer complete. You now hold controlling interest in Fordson Properties. Internal memos dispatched. I sat there in the dark, lit by nothing but the glow of my phone, feeling neither triumphant nor guilty. Just profoundly done. Like I'd carried a boulder up a hill so long I forgot there was ever a top, and now it was finally at rest. I locked the screen, set the phone face down on the table. Inside, someone must have told a joke, because the room burst into laughter again. Probably about Ethan's next project, or maybe about how quaint it was that Marissa showed up tonight in sensible boots. They had no idea. And for the first time in my life, I found I was perfectly okay with that. Because tonight, without a single toast raised in my honor, I'd changed the shape of everything they thought was solid ground. Stick around, because trust me, the moment they figured it out was worth every overlooked invitation that ever came before. I think I'll always remember how calm everything felt right before it stopped being calm. The night air on the terrace had settled into a cool hush, with tiny moths flickering lazily around the overhead heaters. Inside, my family's party seemed to have hit a comfortable groove. People were leaning closer across their tables, smiling with soft, half-drunken ease. From my spot by the railing, I could see Dad standing to give a little wave to someone 2 tables over, probably another investor he'd been trying to lock down for his next luxury build. It would have been a beautiful scene if I hadn't known what was about to rip it wide open. My phone vibrated once more against the table, more of a polite nudge than an urgent shout. I picked it up and found a short, clipped message from Priya. Everything is queued. You're the last signature. Singapore desk stands by. I sucked in a slow breath. The taste of it was eucalyptus and chilled iron from the patio furniture. I flexed my hand once, twice, like I was trying to remind it that it belonged to me and not to the jittery ghost of my younger self. Then I leaned forward, unlocked the device, and pressed my thumb into the secure signature pad. It felt strangely anticlimactic. A brief loading bar, a short green checkmark, and then a final line of text that simply read, executed. Aegis Axis now holds controlling interest, 82.4%. No fanfare. No confetti. Just a quiet, clinical transaction that changed the shape of my entire family's future. I locked the screen and let it rest in my lap. For a few seconds, I just sat there, letting the new reality settle around me like dust. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. If anything, there was a subtle untangling in my chest. The kind you only get after years of walking around with knots so tight you forget they were ever meant to come loose. That was when I heard it. A low, distant rumble that didn't belong to the polite clinks of silverware or the muted laughter from inside. It was a sound I knew well, the kind that crawled up from your stomach before it ever hit your ears. At first, no one seemed to notice. The party inside carried on, forks rising and falling, heads tilted in casual conversation. But then the rumble deepened, rolling closer, picking up a crisp mechanical edge that made even the most oblivious guest pause. A few people drifted toward the big glass doors, blinking at the darkness beyond the patio lights. I looked up just as the sleek silhouette of my chartered jet broke across the top of the tree line. Its lights were clean, precise, a pair of bright eyes scanning the perfect lawn as it began a slow, deliberate descent. The engines didn't roar. They purred, expensive, measured, fully in control. You ever think about how power often speaks in quiet, well-oiled sounds? Not the chest-beating, chest-thumping bravado you see on cable TV. Real power is efficient, professional, and absolutely disinterested in your approval. The jet touched down on the private green, tires kissing the grass so gently it almost looked like a dance step. A gust of displaced air rolled across the terrace, making the little vase of freesias on my table shiver. Someone inside actually gasped, one of those sharp inhalations that practically hung there in the golden light. I heard the sliding door crack open behind me. What the hell is that? It was Ethan's voice, tight and strained, a shade too loud. He didn't sound amused anymore. I turned slightly in my chair and caught sight of him framed by the doorway, hands gripping the handle as if the glass might bolt off its track. Behind him, people were craning their necks, some rising half out of their chairs to get a better look. That, I said, careful to keep my tone even, would be mine. His eyes darted from me to the plane and back again. Yours? What the, Marissa, is that military? Are we about to get swarmed by TSA or some black suit squad? I almost laughed. It's a private charter, Ethan. Relax. No one's coming to frisk your guests. A pair of matte black SUVs rolled up alongside the jet. Their headlights swept across the patio, catching the slight sweat on Ethan's brow. The doors opened in silent synchrony, and my operations team stepped out, all tailored suits and discreet earpieces. The kind of people who made their living ensuring the world ran smoothly without ever needing a round of applause. From the lead vehicle, Hayes emerged, my chief of strategic projects, the one who could juggle $500 million in contracts while also remembering his nephew's baseball stats. He walked with that steady, unbothered stride, holding a slim tablet cradled against one forearm. When he reached my table, he didn't waste time on pleasantries. Ma'am, final contract receipts posted. International desks have confirmed. All board transitions are live. I nodded once, feeling the small twitch of satisfaction deep in my gut. It wasn't triumph, exactly. More like relief that the long game I'd been playing in dusty office buildings and midnight Zoom calls had finally crossed the finish line. Hayes extended the tablet toward me. One last acknowledgement for compliance. I tapped my code in without hesitating. The screen pulsed green again, locking the deal into every ledger that mattered. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. The chatter had flattened out into something uneasy, a dull murmur that chased the edges of the room like a draft. I could see Dad standing near the head table, one hand resting on the back of his chair for balance. His mouth was pressed into that thin line he wore whenever he realized something was spiraling out of his reach. It struck me just then how odd it was that I felt no urge to rub it in. All those years of quietly aching to prove myself, of rehearsing speeches in the shower about why I deserved to be counted, they'd simply evaporated. Because here's the thing. Once you're holding the pen that signs the checks, you stop needing the microphone. Still, a small, wicked curiosity unfurled in my chest. I found myself wondering how long it would take before someone finally dared to walk outside and ask me exactly what I'd just done. And trust me, when that moment came, it was even more satisfying than I'd ever let myself dream. It didn't take long for the ripple of confusion to turn into a quiet panic. Through the broad glass doors, I watched heads whip around, phones raised like shields, people whispering behind cocktail napkins. A few faces were outright pale, eyes darting from the jet on the grass to the dark-suited team by my side. Hillcrest was the sort of place that survived on being predictable. Nobody knew how to handle a disruption that rolled in on turbine engines. The first person brave or nosy enough to break the line was Dad's longtime attorney, Gerald. He came bustling out of the dining hall with his tie skewed a little off-center and a sheen of nervous sweat darkening his temples. The man looked like he'd just jogged a mile in wingtip shoes. "Marissa," he called, voice pitched high like he was trying to sound pleasant for the audience still pressed behind the glass. "What exactly is going on out here? Your aircraft, and these, gentlemen. Is this security for something we should be aware of?" I leaned back slightly in my chair. "They're here for me, Gerald. That's all." He swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing like he was fighting down bile. "I see. Well, there's been, some chatter. A few concerns that perhaps your activities today have impacted certain pending agreements related to Fortson Holdings." I tilted my head. "Concerns from who, exactly?" "Your father, primarily. And, well, Ethan is, understandably, unclear on some paperwork that recently crossed his CFO's desk." At that I almost laughed. Not out of cruelty, more out of that old, tired exasperation. Because if Ethan had actually read half the financial memos he bragged about, none of this would have blindsided him. Hayes stepped forward then, handing Gerald a slim tablet with the newly finalized ownership filings. The man's hands trembled as he scrolled through, mouth pinched tighter with each swipe. You've moved majority control to Aegis Axis," he stammered. 82%. Effective immediately. This is. Marissa, this restructures the entire voting bloc." "Correct," I said calmly. "It also stabilizes your ballooning debt positions and shields the commercial portfolio from 2 pending litigations your team overlooked." "Congratulations." "You're welcome." The corner of Gerald's eye twitched. "Your father is going to want to discuss this privately." "He's welcome to step outside," I said. "Or I can come in. But either way, the contracts are signed. This isn't a negotiation." He sputtered something else, but I barely heard him. Because right then, the big glass doors swung open again and out stepped Dad himself, flanked by Ethan and Sienna like a royal procession. Dad's face was locked in that cold, unreadable mask he'd perfected over decades of boardrooms and banquets. His gray hair was slicked back a little too severely, and his hand curled tightly around the top of his chair as if to keep steady. He didn't approach at first. Just stood there a few feet away, eyes boring into me. I wondered if he was searching for some trace of the daughter he thought he'd trained better. Or if he was already calculating how to spin this at the next Rotary Club breakfast. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Marissa. Care to explain why there's an international acquisition filing with your name on it that effectively seizes the company I built?" I set my phone down slowly, folding my hands in my lap. "It's actually not seized. It's been consolidated. Cleaned up. Saved from your recent financial mismanagement." Ethan bristled immediately. "Saved? You just hijacked decades of work. Dad's entire reputation is tied to Fortson. And mine. Do you even grasp how much damage this could do to investor confidence?" I raised an eyebrow. "Interesting you're worried about perception, not the actual insolvency you've been papering over with deferred interest notes. You keep telling people about Mariposa Towers, Ethan, but you forgot to mention the last 2 payments on the land loan bounced." He blanched, jaw working soundlessly. Sienna put a hand on his arm, though her eyes darted nervously between me and Dad. Her expensive earrings trembled just slightly, betraying her polished composure. Dad finally stepped forward, his voice low and sharp. "You blindsided us. Whatever grievances you've held, this is not how family operates." A quiet fury threaded through me, but I kept my tone level. "No, Dad. Family is supposed to have your back even when it's inconvenient. It's supposed to be curious about what keeps you up at night, not just what makes for good dinner talk. You made it clear years ago your loyalty was to a pristine public image, not to your actual children. His eyes narrowed. That's a cruel oversimplification. Is it? I asked. You called me once, after the convoy incident, to ask if I wanted it buried. Not if I was okay. Not what it cost me. Just whether you needed to mop it off your ledger. A muscle jumped in his cheek, but he didn't respond. The silence that bloomed then was thick enough to drown in. You could almost hear the questions buzzing behind the dining hall windows, where the rest of the party was undoubtedly rubbernecking. Hayes cleared his throat discreetly. Ma'am, would you like to finalize the property side as well? I nodded. Please proceed. Dad's shoulders sank just a fraction. It wasn't defeat exactly, but the first crack in his iron control I'd ever witnessed. Ethan was still glaring at me, hands clenched so tight the veins stood out in bright ridges. Sienna looked like she might cry, mascara already pooling faintly under one lower lash. I stood then, letting the chair scrape lightly against the stone. The sound felt louder than it should have, like punctuation on an entire chapter of my life. I stepped close enough to look Dad square in the eye. This didn't have to be a coup, I said quietly. You all could have asked what I was building. You could have cared enough to wonder. Instead, you left me off the list. Over and over. Consider this just a course correction. I didn't wait for a reply. I turned toward Hayes, who handed me the last sleek black folder. My initials were already embossed on the front, a tiny, satisfying flourish. As I signed the final line, a cool certainty washed through me. Because standing there with 3 pairs of eyes drilling into my back, eyes that once made me question my worth, I finally realized they didn't hold the keys anymore. And if you think that was the last shock of the night, well, just wait. The next move would prove even more instructive for anyone still clinging to the old order. After it was all done, after the signatures were secure and Hayes had slipped away to make quiet calls that would ripple through boardrooms on 2 continents, I stood for a while by the low stone wall at the edge of the terrace. I could still see the glow of the party inside, all that delicate clinking of forks on china and the polite hum of small talk trying to stitch itself back together. It reminded me of how people clear their throats after a loud argument, trying to pretend their voices didn't just crack. Funny. A few hours ago, I would have given almost anything to be seated inside that room. Now I realized how much smaller it looked from this vantage point. My phone buzzed against my palm, startling me slightly. It was a new message, this time from Dad. Just a single line. Let me know when you're ready to discuss next steps. I'll listen. I read it twice, then saved it into a folder on my phone labeled Family Notes, a habit I'd started back when I was still overseas, collecting tiny olive branches that often wilted before they made it home. I didn't respond. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because something in me had finally settled that didn't require his acknowledgement. I slipped the phone into my clutch and walked slowly across the lawn, heels sinking a little into the soft grass. A warm breeze lifted my hair, carrying the faint scent of rosemary from the landscaping. Somewhere near the main building, a server dropped a tray. The crash was sharp and bright, then quickly swallowed by embarrassed laughter. Life, apparently, kept rolling on, whether people realized the foundation had just shifted or not. Out front, the black SUVs waited with quiet patience. The driver by the closest door gave me a courteous nod, like he knew exactly who signed his checks now. I appreciated the lack of fuss. No one rushing to open the door for me, no one tripping over flattery. Just a simple, respectful acknowledgement. It felt cleaner somehow. Inside the car, I leaned my head back against the seat and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my lungs. For a few moments, I just sat there, eyes half closed, listening to the low hum of the engine and the faint, chirpy static from the driver's radio. I thought about how many years I'd spent waiting for the people in that dining hall to see me. To really see me. The ridiculous part was they still might never. And that was finally, blissfully, okay. The car pulled out onto the private drive, the party shrinking behind me into a pocket of soft yellow light among the trees. I watched it disappear in the side mirror. No bitterness, no triumph. Just a quiet sense of completion. I'd stepped fully into my own story. They could keep telling theirs however they needed to. When we reached my hotel downtown, I found a small gift box waiting at the front desk. The tag said simply, "From Sienna." Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with tiny, irregular etchings along the band. Probably some boutique designer's idea of rustic elegance. There was also a handwritten note on thick cardstock. "I'm not sure how you pulled all this off, but part of me is in awe. You've always been braver than the rest of us. Call me if you ever want to style your Forbes shoot. Love, C." I smiled, just a little. Set the note on the dresser in my suite and sat on the edge of the bed, running my thumb over one of the bracelet's notches. Maybe we'd find a way back to each other. Maybe not. Families have fault lines that take a lifetime to stop quivering. But there was a sweetness in knowing the door wasn't entirely slammed. Later that night, long after the emails from International Council slowed to a trickle, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. The grid of streetlights stretched endlessly, each tiny glow a life I'd never meet. Below, a late-night bus rattled past, a few silhouettes slumped against the windows. Somewhere down there, someone was celebrating a birthday without a sibling who couldn't make it home, someone was sending a "you up" text they'd regret in the morning, someone was walking their dog and feeling the first tickle of fall on their bare arms. Life kept doing its messy, miraculous thing. And me? I was finally doing mine. Not as an extension of the Ford family narrative. Not as a daughter orbiting someone else's expectations. Just as Marissa. Builder of complicated logistics webs, quiet buyer of fragile legacies, reluctant owner of a scar that had turned out to be less a flaw and more a credential. Proof that when everything was on the line, I didn't wait around for someone else's permission. It's funny. I used to think I'd someday get a big moment where my father would pull me aside, put a heavy hand on my shoulder, and say something like, "I see now why you did it. You were right." That maybe he'd finally understand how some risks aren't about glory or ego, but about refusing to stand by while good people get steamrolled. That maybe he'd even be proud. But standing there that night, looking out over thousands of anonymous lights, I realized it didn't matter. His understanding was never the measure. I'd already earned my own approval. So here's where I'll leave you for now. Maybe you're someone who's been underestimated your entire life, told in soft or blunt ways that your lane was narrower than you dreamed. Maybe you're still quietly stacking your wins where no one thinks to look. I hope you keep going. I hope one day you get to sit across from all those polite doubters, fold your hands, and smile that calm little smile that says, "I own the building you're bragging about." And if stories like this strike a chord, the kind about families, betrayal, and the slow, steady triumph of just refusing to fade, hit that subscribe. Drop me a comment, tell me what line you've drawn for yourself that no one else sees. Because I promise, there's more of this coming. And next time, we'll push the story even further.